Hi, welcome to part 5 of Learn Buffalo in Go. Today we're going to talk about templates, specifically HTML templates using the default plush render engine. Let's take a look. So if we jump back into our project where we left off, we have our app.go file where we define some routes and those call controllers, and from the individual controllers we can call templates. So here's one for example. Another place to look is in actions, this render.go file. Right here you see HTML layout to be used for all HTML requests. So this application.plush.html file is generated by the Buffalo CLI, and that'll give us all of our HTML page. Another one we'll look at a little bit later is this helpers. This is where we can set up little functions that perform some logic and return a string or even HTML or some other stuff. So let's take a look at that application.plush.html file. This is what we get out of the box with Buffalo. You can see we have a title defined up here. If we change that, got our site running over here. Okay, looks like our title's been changed. All good. What else? Style sheet tag, some CSRF stuff going on here. Tokens. We also have a favicon. Can we change that? Let's see what happens. I added a *_favicon file to our little project here. So if we save that, let's see how we can change that. All right, now we got a little *favicon. Okay, so here's where the work's really going to happen, right, in our body. Buffalo is similar to many frameworks where you have a section that just calls yield, right, and that's where the individual controllers will return some content. In this case, we don't have anything else on this page. The controllers are really going to have to do all the work. What if we don't want to do it that way? We could start to add some content blocks here, and this might be static content of a sort. So now we can see those generate, and if we click through the pages, they're going to appear on every single page. So I'm going to add a third section, messages, and I'm going to go up to our asset CSS, add some styles just so we can start to see the sections on this page and what happens as we start to move forward. Okay, so not pretty, but you can definitely see where these regions or these sections live on the page now. Another thing we can do real quick is change what the front page of our site is. Buffalo out of the box gives us this route home handler, which is convenient for development purposes to show the routes that we have, and maybe for our purposes we can just point that front page to something else and reuse one of the pages that we already have. So we'll just go to the listing of blogs, and now we can see these blogs. If you wanted a custom front page, you could certainly add a custom handler and start to put some logic in there. So if we go back to our parent template, we have some regions here. We're defining all the content there. But what if we had more content than this and it starts to get really big and messy? We could move each of these regions, these pieces out into their own partial template. What is a partial? Partial template is kind of a fragment of HTML that we can use to insert into another template and generate a full page. So in this case we could replace all of this with a call to the partial function and where to find that file. It doesn't really matter what we call these files. I've created a partials directory to hold these. And one thing you'll notice, I have created that file over here, partials_header.plush.html, but over here there's no underscore. So this is a common syntax for partials. There's an underscore at the start, but when we call it we don't need to use that underscore. So now if we reload the page, we should get, nothing should change. We get all the same content. And so there it is. And we can do the same thing down here for our footer. And so now this gets a little bit cleaner. Okay, so I've built out our header region just to have some content that we can look at. Again, we're using a whole bunch of bootstrap classes here to apply some styling. We reload the page, that's what we have over here. I apologize for the colors. Obviously we wouldn't probably go with a color scheme like this, but it's helpful to realize what these regions are, especially when we jump over and look at how regions can be controlled in Buffalo. Let's take a look at this simple wireframe. We have a header, messages, footer region at the bottom, and the yield is in the middle. This works. The controller returns the yield. We can even do some logic in these partials if we needed to, but it is limited, right? So what if we had certain pages where we wanted to add some content at the top, not in the yield section? We could try to add a partial at the top and add some logic to only render on certain pages, but that gets difficult. A better way to solve this is to use what's often called a block. You can define a default block which is empty, or it returns content from the controller. We'll take a look at that in a minute. Maybe another scenario is this page structure is fine for most of our pages, but maybe we have admin pages, something that would look like this. So this is another problem we can solve with the Buffalo plush template system. So to solve that first problem, we can take a look at the Buffalo documentation, content helpers, the contentFor and contentOf. This can be a little confusing if you've seen it in the Go template system or others. The name for this would be block, not contentFor or contentOf, but realize it's the same thing. So how would we do this? We can add the contentOf section where we want on the parent page, and this is where it will appear on the final page. And then we can go to one of the templates that our controller generates and add this contentFor section. So now when we load this page, we can see that the controller is returning this pre-header content way up here. It's not limited to the yield section here. The only problem is Buffalo is expecting that block every time. So we can solve this by adding a default content area. Okay, so now that's there every time. What if we don't really want any content? We won't really want it to generate. We could just leave that block empty. Okay, so that other problem we were seeing was how do we change this overall template? So I've created a real simple form to create a new blog over here. We'll look at how forms work in another episode. This might be the kind of page where we don't want to see all this header footer content. 2 steps to apply a different parent template to this. We go down in our templates, create a new one. Maybe we can just call this admin. And take our application.plush and just copy it in for now. Again, if we look at what we have here, we can just delete content of pre-header, delete header, delete messages, delete footer. Now we go to the specific controller and tell it to use this template instead of the one that is defined here. So that's the blogs router, blogs create. Okay, and so this render function allows us to pass the second parameter, which it would be that global template. And there we go. Another thing to look at real quick, plush templating system, like many, has ways to iterate. So as we see here, this is a 4-element in collection loop. So we can call our item anything we want, our element, and then reference it later inside that loop. And the other one we have is an if-else statement. So if related blogs, render this whole section. So one thing we see here that we could refactor, typically we have things, entities, in this case a blog. A blog might appear in different formats. There's the full page version, there's a teaser version, maybe a card version, things like that. This content is being repeated, but we may have other pages where we want to show blogs in this shortened format. So what could we do? We could create a partial for this. Let's use card for now, plush HTML. And let's move this logic into here. Instead of this, what do we have to render? Just partial. And so there we can see how that works. And that's a nice way to start to develop some component design strategies. The last thing we'll look at is helpers. Buffalo comes with a few helpers, but we can also write our own. The documentation has a page here. One helper we've seen already is the linkTo helper. Here in the header, we are manually creating these links. We could replace this with a linkTo helper. So what is the linkTo helper? It's a function that takes at least 2 parameters. The first is the path, and the second is the content that will be shown. We can pass it here as simple text, Or we can pass a block, similar to what we did with the contentOf and contentFor. So instead of defining it here, we could add a bracket and put some content in if you wanted an image to be a link. So if we change it to this, what do we get? We can see how that renders. The only thing missing is the class. Okay, so that's all fixed. So this blogs path is the route name generated from Buffalo. It's not the one we use here, which can be confusing, right? Our handler is called blogs index, but that actual route is called blogs path. And if we forget what those are, we can call this Buffalo task routes, and what we're looking at is this here. Another thing we can do with this linkTo is we may have to pass some specific parameters into this function in order to generate the proper route. We look over here, I've created a blog called the About page, so for simplicity. So what is the route to an individual blog? It's blog path. So similar to what we did before, we can replace all of this. Buffalo's failing because we have to pass a parameter into this blog path function. This one here, it's expecting an ID, so we have to pass the ID. And I grabbed that UUID from the URL before, and that's what this would look like. So now we can go home, we can go to the About page, our navigation is working. So one thing that's missing from our blogs is the date, and that is a good excuse to try to create some custom helpers. Our blog has a created at and an updated at time. And if we take the blog show, this is the full page, print out the whole time. So we do have the format function available. But what if we didn't want to use this formatting in all of our templates? This would be a good case to create a custom helper. Buffalo documentation has all the information about how helpers work. One place to define a new helper is here in that render.go file. We're going to register a helper name. And what is a helper? It's a function that can return pretty much anything. The simplest would be to just take some data, process it, maybe format it, and return it as a string. So what are the parameters to this function? It'll take a time element and a string, just where we can define these formats. And in here we can use a simple switch statement based on the type of format. So we could have a short time format, we could have a long time format, we could have a abbreviated time format. Anything that is a handy name that's better than having to type out that full format every time. So the short format could just be this one here. And we'll leave this empty for now. Okay, so now formatTIme is registered as a helper, and if we go back to our template, we can use that. Okay, so what are we doing? We're passing in the time element, calling the name of one of the formats that we've defined, and now it should register there. So if we do long, we haven't defined that to return anything but an empty string at this point, so that's what we should get. Something like that. And now that's really handy if we want to come over here and add the format to these cards. Okay, so that's how we could use a custom helper to carry some logic around that would be available to each of our templates. So those are some basics about how to use Plush. We saw how to define our templates, how to create partials, call those partials, create some helpers, and use those across our application. One thing we left out is forms, and that's a whole separate discussion that we'll have in the future. So stay tuned. Thanks.